Deep in the state archives of Dakota Territory sits a folder most historians once dismissed as little more than folklore. Its pages are brittle, its ink faded by time, but the story inside has never lost its power to disturb. Labeled simply Hollow Man's Creek, 1862, the file was sealed for nearly half a century before any researcher was allowed to study it. By then, the survivors were gone, the land was parceled off, and the case had slipped into the shadows of frontier history. Yet for those who lived along the Dakota Plains in the mid-19th century, the name Hollow Man's Creek was whispered like a curse. It was a year of upheaval. The Civil War raged far to the east, draining towns of their strongest men. Immigrant families arrived daily at river ports along the Missouri, driven by hunger and hope. The Homestead Act promised free land to anyone willing to work it, and caravans pushed west into landscapes they barely understood. On maps, Hollow Man's Creek appeared as nothing more than a thin blue vein cutting through rolling grassland. To settlers, though, it was a place of dread. Stories told of storms that came without warning, of wagons lost in whiteouts so complete even horses panicked. For decades, no one could prove those stories were true, until February of 1862, when 20 souls set out from the settlement at Sioux Falls, bound westward for new land. They hired a guide, a man named Elias Thorne, who carried himself with calm confidence and the reputation of never having lost a party to the elements. Families trusted him, as so many before had. But weeks later, only Thorne would walk out of the blizzard alive. The file describes how he stumbled into a soldier's fort, half frozen and clutching a pouch of coins. His tale of wolves and storms sounded convincing enough that officials praised his survival. But buried in that file are witness statements, trakain, APA reports, and artifacts that tell a different story, one of betrayal, greed, and the deliberate abandonment of innocence. What happened on Hollow Man's Creek is not just a tragedy of weather. It is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predator on the plains was not the wolf or the storm, but the man trusted to lead others to safety. The winter of 1862 pressed hard against the eastern settlements of Dakota Territory. Food prices had climbed beyond the reach of many immigrant families, and rumors of fertile land further west spread like fire through the crowded cabins and church halls. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres to any man willing to claim it, and for families who had crossed oceans to escape famine and war, that promise sounded like salvation. By January, 3 families and 2 solitary men had pooled their resources and made a decision that would change their lives forever. They would strike west, through the unsettled prairie. In all, 20 travelers, men, women, and children, prepared for the grueling march. They spent weeks securing wagons, curing meat, and sewing heavy clothing. In February, with supplies loaded and oxen restless, they gathered at the edge of Sioux Falls. Snow lay thick on the ground, but spirits were high. For many, the thought of their own land, unclaimed and waiting, made the cold seem less biting. The families placed their trust in Elias Thorne, a guide who had lived on the frontier for nearly a decade. Thorne had a reputation for uncanny skill in reading storms, for navigating by stars when landmarks vanished, and for never letting hardship break him. Settlers spoke of him with reverence. Some said he could smell snow before clouds even gathered. His fee was high, $50 a family, payable upon arrival, but none doubted his worth. On the morning of departure, wagons creaked forward under the gray winter sky. Children clutched dolls and hymn books. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers stared west with determination. The prairie stretched endless before them, and somewhere out there, new lives waited. They believed they were safe under Thorne's watch. They did not yet know that the man they trusted most had already written their doom. If the families who gathered that February morning were bound together by hope, the glue that held their confidence was a single man, Elias Thorne. To strangers, he looked every bit the archetype of a frontier guide. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years of labor on the plains. His dark hair, streaked with gray at the temples, fell just past his collar, and his pale blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of a person, a wagon, or the shifting clouds overhead. He spoke softly, with a calm certainty that settled nervous children and reassured weary fathers. Thorne's reputation was his most valuable possession. The years, he had guided traders, missionaries, and settlers across some of the harshest stretches of Dakota. He had survived blizzards, outwitted river floods, and earned a quiet fame for his ability to find shelter in places where others would surely perish. Men told stories of how Thorne once saved a party by leading them into a canyon just minutes before a wall of snow buried the prairie behind them. In frontier towns, he was often greeted with respect, even awe. But reputation is a strange thing on the frontier. It is built on stories, often retold by men too relieved to have survived to notice details that didn't quite add up. Thorne encouraged these tales, offering just enough modesty to make his legend seem genuine. He drank rarely, kept no family, and lived in a modest cabin near Yankton. Few ever visited, and fewer still could say they knew what Thorne did when he was not guiding settlers. His private life remained as unbroken as the winter plains. The Halversons, McBrides, Porters, and Brooks brothers placed their faith entirely in him. They handed over their money without hesitation, following his instructions about which tools to pack, which items to discard, and which routes would prove safest. Thorne's confidence was contagious. "Follow me," he told them, "and you'll be in your new homes before the first grass pushes through the snow." His smile was slight but convincing, the kind a man gives when he knows more than he says. None of them noticed the way Thorne studied their wagons not for durability but for wealth. None questioned why he spent long evenings alone with his maps, or why he carried more provisions than any one man. The wagons creaked forward under a pale February sky, oxen straining against the frozen ruts that cut across the prairie. The sound of iron rims biting through ice echoed in the still morning air. 20 travelers stretched into a small caravan, bundled in furs and wool, their breath rising in plumes that drifted away like smoke. At first, the prairie felt endless and promising. The snow-blanketed grasslands shimmered beneath the weak sun. Flat horizons broken only by the occasional cluster of cottonwoods along frozen creeks. Children laughed at the crunch of their boots in the snow, chasing one another until their mothers called them back to the wagons. The first days of travel were not without hardship, but spirits remained high. The Halverson children sang Norwegian hymns at dusk, their voices carrying eerily across the silent plains. Dr. Porter spoke often of the practice he would build, sketching out in his journal the floor plan of a clinic he imagined rising near the Missouri. Margaret McBride sewed by the firelight, her needle glinting, while her husband Jonas kept watch on the horizon, haunted but quietly hopeful. The Brooks brothers, pragmatic and hardworking, took pride in tending the oxen and reinforcing the wagons against the cold. Each night, They circled the wagons close, fires burning high, and Thorn moved among them with the quiet assurance of a man born to the land. To the families, Thorn seemed tireless. He walked for hours ahead of the party, scanning the landscape, returning with instructions for the safest crossing points. He spoke of landmarks, low ridges where Sioux once camped, hidden gullies where trappers had vanished, and trails that stretched like veins through the prairie grass. His knowledge impressed them all, and even in bitter winds, Thorn appeared untouched. Yet small oddities escaped notice. He carried a second satchel, heavier and the first, which he guarded closely, never leaving it unattended. At night, while the families huddled together for warmth, Thorn kept his own fire apart, its embers burning long after theirs had died down. His eyes often drifted over the wagons, not with the admiration of a man shepherding dreams westward, but with the cold calculation of one measuring what could be taken and what could be left behind. The prairie seemed vast and indifferent, swallowing sound and shadow alike. To the families it was freedom. To Thorn it was cover, a blank canvas upon which he would write a story of tragedy that only he was meant to survive. By the fourth day, the prairie had begun to wear on the families. Winds howled endlessly, filling ears with a low moan that seemed to come from the land itself. The oxen grew restless, their sides caked with frost, and the younger children cried more often than they laughed. Supplies were holding, but each mile seemed harder than the last. It was then that Elias Thorn began speaking of a different route. The main trail, he explained, curved south toward Vermilion before bending west again toward the Missouri. That road was longer, he said, and risked adding weeks to their journey. His voice, calm and confident, cut through the fatigue that clung to the wagons like frost. "There is another way," Thorn assured them. "A direct line west through Hollow Man's Creek. Few guides know it, but I have walked it before. It will save us nearly 2 weeks of hardship." And yet Thorn seemed strangely calm. While others scraped frost from their lashes and fought to keep fires alive, he moved through the storm with unnerving certainty, fetching wood, tending his horse, and claiming that morning would bring relief. Few noticed how easily he navigated the canyon, as if he had walked it many times before. 2 days passed inside the canyon, and the storm showed no mercy. Snow piled high against the wagons until only their tops remained visible. Families burned wagon boards to keep their fires alive, the smoke curling weakly into the blizzard before vanishing into the white. Each crack of timber on the fire was both a relief and a reminder. Every board burned meant one less chance of moving forward when the skies finally cleared. Food, carefully rationed for a month-long journey, dwindled at a terrifying pace. Meat froze so hard it splintered beneath knives. Flour clumped in sacks, damp from the seeping snow. Mothers tore strips of cloth to wrap around children's feet, trying to shield them from the creeping numbness of frostbite. The Halverson girls shivered in silence, lips turning blue despite their mother's desperate embrace. Margaret McBride prayed aloud, her words nearly drowned by the storm's howl. Meanwhile, Elias Thorn appeared almost untouched by the misery that crushed the others. While the families huddled together for warmth, Thorn tended his own small fire apart from the group. He always seemed to have wood to burn, though no one saw him gather it. His satchel, still curiously heavy, never seemed to run empty. When asked how he managed to keep his strength, Thorn shrugged and muttered about preparation. Yet his skin lacked the pallor of frostbite. His voice carried none of the exhaustion that weighed down the others. It was Jonas McBride who first noticed the unsettling pattern. Thorn ate when others starved. Thorn's boots, remained dry when the rest slogged through half-frozen snow. He seemed to know exactly where to step in the canyon, never stumbling, never searching. When Jonas shared his unease with his wife, Margaret urged him not to sow fear. "He's the only reason we're alive at all," she insisted, clutching her son close. Jonas said no more, but the doubt lingered. By the third night, hunger gnawed through every wagon. Infants cried weakly, mothers wept, and fathers stared helplessly at dwindling supplies. The storm showed no sign of breaking, and whispers of abandoning the wagons began to circulate. But Thorn silenced them. "To move in this is death," he warned, his pale eyes flashing in the firelight. "Stay, and you'll live. Leave, and the prairie will claim you." None of them realized that Thorn's words were not meant as advice. They were a sentence. On the third night, as the storm raged with no end in sight, the families reached the edge of despair. Fires sputtered low, children whimpered in half-sleep, and even the strongest men sat silent, their faces hollowed by hunger and cold. It was then that Elias Thorn made his announcement. "I've seen smoke," he said, his voice steady but low. "A camp not far from here. Maybe hunters, maybe soldiers. If I ride out at first light, I can reach them and bring help back before sundown." The families clung to his words like drowning men grasping a rope. A murmur of hope ran through the camp. Could there truly be shelter so near? Thorn nodded gravely, his eyes fixed on the fire. "But I must go alone. To split our strength in this storm is suicide. Stay close to the wagons. Keep the children warm. By tomorrow night, this will all be over." At first, there were doubts. Jonas McBride, hardened by war, muttered that he trusted the marked trails more than any supposed shortcut. But the promise of arriving before spring storms weighed heavily on the group. Dr. Porter, worried for his infant daughter, leaned toward Thorn's proposal. The Brooks brothers were eager to reach ranching land before other settlers claimed it. Even Margaret McBride, cautious by nature, whispered that if Thorn truly knew a quicker way, perhaps God himself had sent him to guide them. The decision was made in the flicker of firelight. Parents, bone-tired and anxious, gave in to the idea of rest sooner rather than later. Thorn's plan seemed almost providential. He spoke of Hollow Man's Creek with such certainty, describing its shallow banks, its hidden groves, and its supposed shelter from wind, that his words painted it as a haven rather than a hazard. No one noticed the slight curl at the corner of Thorn's mouth as he studied their faces, watching hesitation melt into trust. He had led other groups along the safe, marked trails. This time, his choice of direction was deliberate. When the wagons turned north of the main trail the next morning, snow crunching under iron wheels, none of the families understood that they had left safety behind. They entered a land known to trappers as treacherous, where storms funneled between bluffs and whiteouts swallowed entire herds. Thorn did not tell them this. He rode at the head of the caravan, silent, the shortcut fixed in his mind not as salvation, but as a trap. The prairie has a way of changing its face in an instant. One moment the horizon stretched wide and calm, the sun muted but steady. The next, a wall of white rose in the distance, creeping low to the ground like smoke from some unseen fire. At first, the families thought it was nothing, just another dusting of snow. But Thorn, riding a hare, slowed his horse and stared at the horizon with a hard expression that none of them could quite read. By midday, the storm was upon them. The wind came first, shrieking across the open land, tearing shawls from shoulders and scattering hats into the snow. Then the snow fell, not in gentle flakes but in sharp pellets that stung exposed skin and blurred the world into a shifting haze of white. Visibility shrank to mere feet. The prairie that had stretched endlessly around them was gone, swallowed whole by the blizzard. The wagons groaned under the weight of gathering snow, oxen bellowing as frost clung to their muzzles. Parents clutched children close, wrapping them in wool and blankets, whispering reassurances they themselves barely believed. The Brooks brothers tried to keep the oxen moving, shouting into the storm, but the animals stumbled blindly, their hooves sinking into drifts that grew deeper by the hour. Thorne barked orders with unusual force. "Into the creek bed," he shouted over the howling wind. "The bluffs will shield us." His voice carried the authority of a man who had survived such tempests before. No one questioned him. The wagons veered from the faint trail into the narrow valley of Hollow Man's Creek, snow already choking the path. The canyon walls loomed high, their stone faces funneling the wind into a roar that rattled the wagons like tin toys. What Thorne called shelter was, in truth, a trap. The bluffs did not break the storm, they amplified it. Snow swirled in whirlwinds, piling against the wagons in suffocating drifts. The air grew so cold it burned the lungs. By nightfall, families huddled inside wagons half buried in snow, fires flickering weakly against the gale. Children cried softly in the darkness, their voices muffled by the storm. Margaret McBride begged him to take Jonas along, but Thorne refused. "The path is narrow," he said. "I ride faster alone." When Dr. Porter offered to accompany him, citing his duty to protect the weak, Thorne dismissed him too. "Your wife and child need you more than I do," Thorne replied, his tone final. At dawn, Thorne saddled his horse with quiet efficiency. He loaded his satchel, cinched his coat tight, and mounted without ceremony. The families watched as he rode into the white void of snow, his figure swallowed quickly by the storm. They waited for the sound of hooves to fade, but in the howling wind, it was gone almost instantly. Hours passed. Fires dwindled lower. No one dared speak of what gnawed at their hearts, that Thorne might never return. By sunset, hope began to wither. The Brooks brothers lit signal fires, sending plumes of smoke skyward in case Thorne was searching for them. The flames guttered in the wind, their glow pitiful against the storm's fury. The night that followed was the darkest yet. With no guide, no food, and no certainty, the families huddled together and tried to believe he would come back. But in their silence, a truth pressed heavier than the snow on their wagons. They had been left. Nearly 2 weeks later, long after neighbors had assumed the families perished in the blizzard, a lone figure stumbled into the frontier post at Yankton. His horse was half dead beneath him, ribs jutting like broken boards. His own face was gaunt, beard rimed with frost, eyes red from wind and sleepless nights. But it was Elias Thorne, alive when none expected him to be. He collapsed at the fort gates, clutching a weathered pouch to his chest. Soldiers carried him inside, where the heat of the stove brought groans from his frozen lips. When he could finally speak, his words came halting, punctuated by sobs. "They're gone," he gasped. "The storm, wolves, God help me. I tried." The story he told over the next days was one of horror and heroism. The families, he claimed, had been too weak to endure the blizzard. He had begged them to hold on, but the cold cut through their wagons, and one by one, they succumbed. Then came the wolves, gaunt, desperate from the winter, circling the camp with glowing eyes. Thorne described fighting them off through the night, swinging axes and firing until his ammunition was gone. "I buried who I could," he said, tears streaking his frost-burned cheeks. "But there were too many. Too many." The soldiers and townsfolk listened with solemn faces. They had all known the cruelty of prairie storms. They had all heard tales of wolves bold enough to tear into camps. Thorn's wounds, superficial frostbite on his hands and face, cracked lips and hollow eyes, seemed to confirm his ordeal. When asked about the pouch he carried, Thorn explained it contained the pooled savings of the families. He said he had gathered the coins from their bodies, determined to return the money to surviving relatives rather than let scavengers steal it. "It was all I could do for them," he whispered, "a last promise to the dead." To most, it sounded like the testimony of a broken man who had done everything possible in the face of tragedy. Officials praised his endurance. Settlers spoke of his loyalty, calling him the unluckiest yet bravest guide on the plains. No one asked why, out of 20 travelers, he alone had survived with supplies intact. No one wondered yet how a man so supposedly starved still had the strength to ride through a storm that had buried an entire caravan. That doubt would come later. For several weeks, Elias Thorne's story stood unchallenged. Settlers mourned the lost families, their names whispered in church services and printed in small-town gazettes. Thorne, though frail and solemn, carried himself as a man burdened by tragedy. He walked the streets of Yankton with lowered eyes, clutching the pouch of coins until the territorial officials relieved him of it. To many, he was a hero marked by sorrow. But not everyone believed. Doubt first stirred in the mind of Jonah Keats, a trapper who roamed the creek beds west of Yankton. Keats had weathered storms harsher than the one Thorne described, and something about the tale gnawed at him. He insisted that wolves, in such weather, would never linger long in open ground. They, too, would seek shelter. His skepticism deepened when he heard Thorne speak of the Box Canyon, where the families had taken refuge. Keats knew that place. It offered no shelter at all. One March morning, following his trap lines near Hollow Man's Creek, Keats stumbled on something that stopped him cold. Beneath a rocky overhang, shielded from the wind, was a campsite, neatly stacked firewood, canvas stretched taut against the stone, and provisions salted and sealed. Snow had drifted against it, but the camp was too well prepared to be accidental. It had been built long before the storm. More disturbing still were the objects scattered around it. A child's mitten, stitched with careful thread. A woman's silver brooch of Scandinavian design. A leather strap torn from what might have been a doctor's satchel. Keats recognized them as things the doomed families had carried. He gathered what he could and rode hard for Yankton. When presented with the items, the territorial marshal's brow furrowed. Thorne's testimony had been clear. The families died in the blizzard, their possessions scattered or buried. But here was evidence not of chaos, but of control. Supplies hidden, valuables kept, and belongings discarded like trophies. Rumors spread quickly through the settlement. Why had Thorne alone survived? Why had he returned with coins but not with heirlooms or papers? And how had he known to lead them into the canyon at all? What had once sounded like tragedy now reeked of betrayal. For the first time, people began to ask the question that would unravel Thorne's carefully woven tale. Had he saved himself or planned the family's deaths from the start? Once Jonah Keats' discovery reached the territorial authorities, an investigation was inevitable. Marshal Henry Dillard led the inquiry, a man known for his sharp instincts and his reluctance to accept simple answers. At first, he questioned Thorne again, asking him to recount the storm, the wolves, and the final moments of the families. Thorne repeated his tale with practiced sorrow, but Dillard noticed something troubling. The details shifted ever so slightly each time. A distance shortened, a description altered, a death recast more dramatically. When Dillard's men searched Thorne's modest cabin outside Yankton, the cracks in his story widened into gaping holes. Hidden beneath floorboards was a bundle of items unmistakably tied to the dead families. A silver locket engraved with the initials LP. Lydia Porter, the doctor's wife. A Norwegian Bible filled with pressed flowers that Margaret McBride had been seen carrying. Even more damning were the maps found rolled inside his travel chest. They were not ordinary trail guides, but hand-marked with notes about weather patterns, hidden valleys, and cache sites. Each mark indicated where supplies had been buried in advance: salted meat, firewood, blankets. The very kind of camp Jonah Keats had uncovered. The maps proved foresight, not desperation. Neighbors recalled other oddities, too. A blacksmith swore Thorne had purchased far more provisions than necessary for a single guide: extra flour, cured meat, and kerosene. A rancher admitted he once saw Thorne riding near Hollowman's Creek months before the tragedy, though Thorne had claimed never to scout that region. Piece by piece, the image of a heroic survivor collapsed. The more investigators pressed, the clearer it became. Thorne had not stumbled into survival. He had orchestrated it. He led families into a death trap, waited out the storm in his secret camp, and then plundered their remains before returning to Yankton as the grieving sole survivor. When the evidence was presented to the community, shock turned to outrage. The tale of wolves and blizzards no longer sounded tragic. It sounded calculated. Elias Thorne was no victim of the storm. He was its architect. The discovery that ended all doubt came in late March, when search parties rode out to Hollowman's Creek to recover whatever traces the storm had left behind. Snow still choked the gullies, but the drifts had begun to recede. What the men uncovered was not the scattered remains of a caravan destroyed by wolves. It was something far darker. Near the canyon's bend, under a shallow drift of earth and snow, the searchers found the first grave. Inside lay the small body of a child wrapped not in a blanket but in torn burlap sacks. The face was thin, lips cracked, eyes closed as if in sleep. There were no signs of wolf attack, no claw marks or ragged wounds, only the unmistakable signs of hunger and exposure. The searchers found more as they dug along the creek bed. A second child, then a third, all carefully placed in shallow pits, all dead from cold and starvation rather than beasts or storm. The remains told a chilling story. The children had not died quickly in a sudden catastrophe. They had been kept alive, barely, for days after Thorne claimed the tragedy ended. Tiny scraps of food were found near their mouths, bits of dried meat, crusts of bread, enough to prolong life, but never enough to save it. Dr. Samuel Porter's satchel was recovered nearby, its contents rifled, his instruments missing. It was clear now that Thorne had visited the site repeatedly, scavenging what he wished, feeding just enough to keep some alive, perhaps fearing a search party might arrive too soon. To the men who stood over those frozen bodies, one realization hit like a blow. Thorne had not merely abandoned the families. He had watched them die slowly, returning to strip their belongings as they weakened. Word of the graves spread like wildfire through Yankton and beyond. Mothers wept at the thought of children crying in the snow, calling for help that never came. Fathers clenched fists and swore vengeance. The frontier had seen its share of storms, of Indian raids, of wolf attacks. But this was something different. This was deliberate. When Marshal Dillard presented the evidence to the territorial court, the tone shifted entirely. The case was no longer about a blizzard's cruelty. It was about murder, cold, systematic, and merciless. And the man once praised as a hero was now seen for what he truly was, a predator who preyed not on animals, but on trust itself. The trial of Elias Thorne began in the spring of 1862 at the Territorial Courthouse in Yankton. By then, the story of Hollow Man's Creek had traveled far beyond Dakota Territory. Newspapers from St. Paul to Chicago sent correspondents to cover the proceedings, dubbing it the Blizzard Murders. Crowds filled the small courtroom each morning, some traveling days by wagon to witness the spectacle. For frontier families who lived with the daily fear of blizzards and starvation, Thorne's betrayal struck a nerve deeper than any outlaw raid or Indian attack. Thorne entered the courtroom dressed neatly, his frostbitten hands healed, his beard trimmed. He carried himself with the same quiet composure that had once won the trust of families now buried beneath snow. If not for the whispers of murderer that rippled through the gallery, one might have mistaken him for a respected tradesman, rather than a man accused of slaughtering 19 souls. Prosecutor Charles Renshaw wasted no time laying out the case. He presented the stolen heirlooms, the locket engraved LP, the Norwegian Bible, and Dr. Porter's medical instruments. He displayed the maps, annotated with cache sites, weather notes, and routes through Hollow Man's Creek. Witnesses testified. Jonah Keats described the hidden camp with its neatly stacked firewood. The blacksmith recalled Thorne's unusual bulk purchases. The rancher swore he had seen Thorne scouting the creek months before the tragedy. Each testimony stripped away another layer of Thorne's survivor's tale. Most damning was the medical testimony regarding the children's remains. Dr. Everett Callahan, summoned from Sioux City, explained with clinical precision that the bodies bore no marks of animal attack, no wounds from violence. Instead, they showed clear signs of prolonged starvation and frostbite. They were not killed by storm or wolf, Callahan said firmly. They were left to die. The defense, led by attorney Robert Finch, grasped for doubt. He argued that scavengers could have moved the belongings, that rivals like Jonah Keats might have planted evidence, that Thorne himself had been framed by jealous competitors in the guide trade. Thorne took the stand, his voice breaking as he insisted he had done all he could, that he was haunted every night by the cries of the dying. His performance moved some to tears. But the prosecution countered with one brutal question. If he had done all he could, why was he the only one who lived? The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. When they returned, the room fell into a silence so heavy that even the shuffling of boots seemed indecent. The foreman, a farmer with weathered hands, stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts of murder. The words struck like a hammer. Women gasped, men nodded grimly. For the families who had lost their loved ones in Hollow Man's Creek, justice, at least in name, had been spoken. Thorne stood without flinching, his face carved into stone. Only his pale blue eyes betrayed the slightest flicker of defiance. When Judge Amos Kendall asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Thorne finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost chillingly so. I did what I had to do to survive. You sit in judgment, but none of you were there. None of you heard the wind tear children's voices from their mother's arms. None of you know the cost of walking out alive. He paused, lips curling faintly. Call me a murderer if it eases your conscience. Judge Kendall's reply was swift and sharp. He called Thorne's actions an abomination against trust itself, a betrayal of the very faith that binds men and women on the frontier. He declared that Thorne had weaponized the desperation of innocent families, using the storm as a cloak for his crimes. This territory cannot allow men like you to walk free. For the sake of justice, for the memory of those children, and for the protection of every family who dares to cross these plains, there can be only one sentence. The gavel fell. Thorne was ordered to be hanged by the neck until dead. The execution date was set for June 21, 1862. On the morning of his hanging, crowds gathered outside the small territorial prison. Some came from as far as Minnesota, traveling days simply to see justice delivered. Mothers clutched their children, fathers stood in grim silence, and veterans of the frontier crossed their arms, staring hard at the scaffold. Thorne mounted the steps with measured strides, refusing both priest and blindfold. When asked for final words, he stared at the horizon and said, "The storm chose its victims, not I." The crowd erupted in anger. Moments later, the trapdoor fell, and Elias Thorne swung before the eyes of the people whose trust he had shattered. Would you like me to finish the story with Section 15, Legacy of Hollow Man's Creek, where we explore the aftermath, folklore, and how this case haunted the frontier? The execution of Elias Thorne did not end the whispers of Hollow Man's Creek. If anything, it deepened them. For decades after, settlers avoided the narrow canyon where the families had perished. Wagon masters refused to guide parties through it, and ranchers left the land untouched. They claimed the ground itself was cursed, that oxen balked at its edge, that children cried in their sleep when camps were pitched too near. Some swore that on winter nights, when the wind rushed through the bluffs, it carried with it the faint cries of children calling for their mothers. The territorial government moved quickly to prevent another such tragedy. Laws were passed requiring guides to register with local authorities and provide references from previous clients. No longer could a man build a reputation on rumors and half-told stories. Territorial marshals were granted authority to inspect caches and trail supplies, and rewards were offered for reporting suspicious behavior among those who hired themselves as frontier guides. Thorne's betrayal had made clear that storms were not the only danger. Misplaced trust could be deadlier still. For the families who never returned, memorials were few. Wooden crosses were raised at the creek's edge, though many rotted away within years. Dr. Porter's remaining instruments were given to a hospital in Sioux City, where they were used for nearly a decade. Margaret McBride's surviving relatives established a small scholarship for frontier widows, funded by donations collected in her name. But most of the dead faded into silence, remembered only in fragile letters sent back east, or in local sermons preached long after their bodies were gone. As for Hollow Man's Creek itself, it became a place of folklore. Hunters claimed to see a rider moving through the snow, tall in the saddle, pale-eyed and silent, vanishing into the storm. Children dared each other to camp by the creek, swearing they heard wagon wheels creak in the night, though no trail had passed in years. And in local taverns, old men told the tale of Elias Thorne, the Hollow Man, who